It's very nice to see so many faces, actually, and it's always a source of great satisfaction, actually, when a good number of people turn up to an event like this. I was in Minehead last night, at the far end of deepest, darkest Somerset, at a neighbourhood watch meeting I'd been invited to, where there were 30 or 40 people who turned up, I'd say, not quite such glorious weather, to listen to a crusty old Chief Superintendent like me, and I was very grateful for that. Equally, I'm grateful for you coming this evening. So, a little bit about me then. I'm not a local person, unlike Sue. I spent my first, I've 30 years service now, but I spent my first 25 years working in Leicestershire, and I transferred down here in 2010 to take on a role at Taunton, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a moment. But for the last 8 years, or 7 of the last 8 years at least, I've fulfilled the same role as I fulfil now, which is as an area commander, looking after directly the policing services of a geographic area. In my case now, that's grown a little bit. So when I arrived in 2010, there were 6 people like me looking after 6 areas within Avon and Somerset. There are now 3 people like me looking after the same areas in Somerset, and in fact there were 3 people like me doing the job I'm doing now up until a couple of years ago. So my job has grown quite considerably and has become all the more rewarding for it. But when I started in 2010, I was looking after the 3 district council areas of West Somerset, Taunton Deane and Sedgemoor. And when I came back to local policing after a year away up at headquarters, almost exactly a year ago to the day, I found myself looking after the entire county of Somerset and the Unitary Authority of North Somerset, where we are tonight. So effectively I'm covering everything policing wise from Avonmouth down onto Exmoor, where I live, all the way down to the Devon border and across to Wincanton, Yeovil and just about everywhere in between, with about 22 police stations, and there are about 1,000 officers and staff looking after that area. Not all are mine now, but most of them are. And so consequently, when people ask me where I'm based, the usual answer they get is, well, actually in my car. I seem to do an inordinate amount of driving, but actually what a glorious place to drive, so I'm not complaining. What that does for me, though, is give me a bit of a challenge, because actually, when you take an area which was so big and you make it yay big, then necessarily when you're the person who's responsible for it, your level of detail and knowledge and understanding about what goes on in that area is necessarily a bit limited. So I rely very heavily now on my senior leadership team and the local people to keep me informed of the issues that I need to be informed about, but also events like this so that people can speak to me directly. And they're not just bodyguards, I promise, but Stuart Bell at the back, who's the Chief Inspector who's responsible for North Somerset, is a member of my senior leadership team. And Sharon, sat next to him, Sharon Bennett, is a very able local neighbourhood manager, neighbourhood inspector, who looks after the sorts of things that you're probably most interested in. She looks after the priorities that Sue has set for us. She looks after the neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs who you'll see and interact with probably most. So we have changed significantly in structure, and we've downsized very significantly our senior management team, people like me, largely as a part of the process to try and keep, as Sue has described earlier, as many of the cuts away from the front line as we possibly can, and quite rightly too. Sue's touched on these numbers, but since 2010 we have saved £46 million, a frightening sum of money, and actually I have to say we've done so, I wouldn't say it's not painless at all, but relatively painlessly, I have to say, in terms of the service that we provide to the public. But by 2018, we're going to have to find about £80 million worth of savings. And I think the next 4 or 5 years are actually going to be somewhat more painful. And it's the job of myself and Sue and others to try and ensure we minimise the impact upon local policing as far as we're possibly able to. And when you set that in context, our demand is growing very significantly. So this is the part where you get to answer a quick quiz question. So are you up for that? Are we up for a bit of a quiz? How many calls do you think we get a day into Avon and Somerset Constabulary? Anybody like to hazard a guess? Don't be shy.
1,000.
1,000, okay. Any advance on 1,000?
10,000.
10,000. Sorry? Oh, did somebody say 25,000? That's the fastest rate of inflation I've ever seen. It's actually 5,000. 5,000 calls a day. And we attend about 1,000 of those. So the other 4,000 will often be calls for advice. It might be about a matter of law, it might be some advice about where to get their shotgun certificate renewed, or it might be any other matter. But about 1,000 we attend. But also, what I've seen, and I was reflecting on yesterday evening at Minehead, was a real shift in the sorts of work we do too. So you'll have famously heard that crime is at its lowest level in donkey's years. And that is, I think, in large part true, although I do think a lot of crime has shifted online now and is perhaps somewhat underreported. But in terms of traditional crime, it is at its lowest level for a very long time. But actually, we find ourselves being drawn more and more into caring for the vulnerable more than we ever were before. And of course, it's always been our role. You know, our key roles are to protect life and property. Protection of life has always become right at the forefront of the police officer's affirmation or oath. But actually, we have something called a situation report, which every morning at about 6:30, over my bowl of Frosties, with kids in my ears, shouting about what they've got on during the course of the day, I tend to read on my mobile phone. And what I've seen shift in the last decade or so has been pretty significant. And things that used to appear on that SITREP a decade or so ago were things like armed robberies, serious assaults, and serious crime. And what I see on that situation report now, almost every day, is predominantly people who are vulnerable who need our help. Predominantly it's people who are missing, and not only are they missing from their loved ones, but they are actually at serious risk of harm, either by harming themselves or by harm from other people. And it is forming an amazing proportion of our work, very, very significant part of work, and it's a real concern to me and colleagues to try and manage that, and to do so absolutely to the best of our ability to protect those most vulnerable people. So, whilst demand has fallen in traditional crime types, the sorts of work we deal with and the types of demand that we're faced with, they've increased in other areas, particularly around vulnerability. So what have we been doing in that context to try and meet that demand at the same time as having a shrinking budget? Well, we've considerably reorganised ourselves in the last year or two, and I've had a bit of a hand in that in myself in the year I spent up here at headquarters. We've significantly reorganised ourselves in a way which we hope, and you'll be the judge of this of course, but in a way that we hope will have the maximum return on the cuts that we have to make. In other words, by protecting as far as possible the front line, and by organising ourselves in a way where you as members of the public hopefully notice the minimal amount of change or difference. So we're trying to meet expectations, meet increasing demand by new ways of working. That includes completely reorganising in March this year the way that our neighbourhood officers and our response officers work together, by completely reorganising in September last year how our specialist resources, those who are looking at child abuse or serious crime investigation or any other range of traditional criminal investigation type work together, and brigading some of those specialist resources around some key new police centres. Bridgewater is the one that's within my area, the big new PFI building there, but we've got similar buildings at Keynsham and Patchway. So we've brigaded specialist resources there, but absolutely have kept a commitment to keep our uniformed patrolling resources, police officers and PCSOs, as local as we possibly can. And what's that meant is that in that backdrop of all that increasing demand and the shrinking budgets, we have actually had some notable success. And Sue touched on the priorities that she sets for the organisation. So I can tell you that here in North Somerset, for example, in relation to antisocial behaviour, we've actually managed to reduce reports of antisocial behaviour in North Somerset by 6% in the last year. And at the same time, increase satisfaction from people who are victims of antisocial behaviour up to 80%, and to fully resolve over 60% of all those cases, which is a massive improvement on where we were 12 months ago. In relation to the burglary priority, we've had some modest success. We've managed to reduce burglary by about 1% in North Somerset. That's not a huge number, but it's certainly less victims than we had last year. And one of the things I think, without wishing to embarrass Sue, one of the things I think that she should be proudest of actually in her tenure is the Lighthouse service, so the Victim and Witness Care Service, part of which for this area, for my area, is based at Bridgewater Police Centre, where people are really working exceedingly hard to meet the needs of vulnerable, intimidated and persistently targeted victims, and in my view doing a truly wonderful job. Equally, Somerset is a challenge around road safety, and I'm sure we can talk about that in questions, but that's certainly something that we've been putting a lot of effort into. And the Constabulary have recently appointed a superintendent, a gentleman who used to be one of my senior leadership team actually recently, as the head of road safety for Avon and Somerset. So we've invested in a very senior police officer's post to address road safety issues in a consistent and coordinated way across the entire constabulary. And finally, in terms of domestic abuse and sexual offences, and this may not sound like a success, but we're actually quite proud of it. We've got an increase of nearly 20% of offences reported in North Somerset. Now, why should that be a figure that we're more proud of than ashamed? Well, historically, I can tell you over my 30-year career, those two categories of crime have always been dreadfully underreported because people haven't had the confidence to come forward to report to the police because they either might not think we take it seriously or they're concerned about the consequences. And thankfully, we've come a very long way in that time, and now we are seen ever more as being approachable. And so that 20% isn't really, in our view, a true increase in the levels of recorded crime, or levels of crime that have taken place. Actually, what it reflects is a proper now reporting of what was suppressed before because people didn't feel confident to talk to us. So I'll hope you see that we continue to work tirelessly to try and do our very best to serve the public of North Somerset and the rest of Avon and Somerset Constabulary to our absolute utmost. We are all members of the public too. We're members of the public first and police officers second. And so what we do for you, we also do for ourselves, for our friends, for our family, for our loved ones, and we're all very passionate about trying to do that in the best way possible. So I really look forward later to hearing some of your questions and perhaps taking some personal feedback from you at the end when we've finished about how you're experiencing those police services here in North Somerset. And if we can possibly do something to improve those, then absolutely Sharon, Stuart, myself will move heaven and earth to try and do that for you. So thank you very much for listening. I'll hand you back to whoever's next, actually. I'm not quite sure who that is.